Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Stocks ending the day mixed today. Chip makers leading the declines amidst what is now a daily escalation in tension between the United States and China. TikTok says it now plans to sue the Trump administration, calling the president's efforts to ban it or force a sale to a U.S. company unconstitutional. Twitter now reportedly potentially interested as well. China has now sanctioned almost a dozen U.S. officials in retaliation after the U.S. sanctioned several Chinese officials last week. We are standing by for the president to deliver another news briefing at the bottom of the hour. This after he signed 4 executive orders over the weekend on several issues, including unemployment benefits, payroll taxes, student loans, while lawmakers are still negotiating a possible broader relief bill. Joining us to talk about how investors have digested this today are Abigail Doolittle, who's been looking at the ups and downs. Abigail, were there any clear drivers in one direction today?
Funny enough, there really were not, Emily, and it was a bit of a whipsaw day. First, the bulls were out, and then we reversed lower for some of the indexes. The NASDAQ, though, that tech-heavy index had been lower all day. So to the best of my ability to determine, what we saw today was what some are calling the reopening rotation. So some of the cyclical sectors, such as energy, industrials, materials, those climbed. As we saw those sectors climb, that was when some of the tech stocks started to drop, Apple leading the way. And then Apple rebounded, leading the S&P 500 back higher. The Dow also back higher. The NASDAQ did not make it up. The S&P 500, its 7th up day in a row, the longest winning streak since 2017, excuse me. I was just thinking about the Russell 2000, up 1%, and that shows really that divergence. The more value and cyclically oriented indexes such as the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the Russell 2000 really outperforming. As for some of the individual movers on the move beneath the surface, Emily, it's pretty interesting here, at least to me. MGM Resorts and Marriott, huge wins there on the day. And it's interesting only because they had very difficult, they've had a difficult year with the pandemic. But today, investors going back into these stocks, Royal Caribbean said that 2021 is expected to be better. Of course, China is now allowing tourists to go back into Macau, issuing tourist visas for the first time since January on a trial basis. So MGM higher. Marriott reported a somewhat better than expected quarter in some ways. Also looks like occupancy in China is improving, plus occupancy improving overall. So people really those looking for those bright spots. But the big winner, Emily, is Apple, up 1.5%. This is really the star on the year. We did have Dan Ives, who you know very well, over at Wedbush. He raised his price target to a street high of $515, saying this company is close to a $2 trillion market cap. Buy it.
Interesting, because we did have Dan Ives on last week talking about just how devastating a potential ban on U.S. companies working with WeChat could be, because it's a huge driver of, why consumers buy phones in China so that they can use apps like WeChat. Talk to us a little bit about some of the other tech names, Apple, Microsoft, Twitter, all sort of tied into this TikTok situation.
Indeed, Emily. That Microsoft, TikTok, Twitter situation is really interesting. But before we do, I just want to really point out the degree of this possible $2 trillion market cap for Apple, which, if we go into the Bloomberg terminal and we take a look at this chart, this is Apple's percentage of its market cap of the Russell 2000. So Apple's market cap of 1.9, let's just call it $3 trillion, is about 90% of the Russell 2000. That's just extraordinary. That one stock alone, almost 90% of that small cap index. So that really puts that into perspective, just how dominant Apple is at this point. As for those other names, it was a down day for Microsoft, so that was one of those tech drags. On the other hand, Twitter popping on this news that they may, in fact, put in a bid for TikTok, those U.S. assets, a possible bidding war. And talk about market cap, Emily. Microsoft, which, of course, has confirmed that they are likely to put in a bid, their market cap almost $1.6 trillion. Twitter, just about $30 billion. Huge spread there. Nonetheless, it looks like they possibly will be competing for those TikTok U.S. assets, Emily.
Right. So much to examine here. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for breaking it all down. Continuing on this theme, the fate of Chinese social media apps and their parent companies facing a cloud of uncertainty. TikTok now saying it intends to sue the Trump administration, calling the president's efforts unconstitutional. With us now is Stuart Baker, counsel at Steptoe and Johnson, a former assistant secretary for policy at the Department of Homeland Security. He's been looking closely at this. So, Stuart, first of all, what do you make of TikTok's claims here? They're saying they could sue the president as early as tomorrow, saying that this is unconstitutional, what he is trying to do. Is it actually unconstitutional, or is this well within the president's power?
So it's certainly within his statutory power. Anybody can argue that they've been treated unfairly and that that's a violation of the Due Process Clause. TikTok's going to have an uphill battle because all that's really required under the executive order is a determination that TikTok is from an adversary nation and is posing a risk to the national security of the United States or the security of Americans. And TikTok's had a lot of problems handling data. It's subject to Chinese law to a degree that makes it a little hard for them to argue that none of those things are relevant and that they shouldn't have been considered. And if they were considered, they got a kind of due process. So I'm guessing that lawsuit will make a lot of noise, but probably doesn't prevail.
You have spent time as the general counsel at the NSA. You're also the host of the weekly Cyber Law podcast. So I know that this is something that you've been thinking deeply about. I mean, do you believe that TikTok is a security risk to the United States? It
collects a lot of data, just as many American companies do, although it probably collects a little more. And where that data is and how it's going to be made available to foreign governments is still subject to some uncertainty. And the success of Chinese social media in the United States raises real questions, not just about whether Americans' data is going to be used against U.S. interest, but also whether the news that we all get from social media is going to be tilted in the same way that the news in Hong Kong is now tilted in favor of the Chinese government. So, those are legitimate national security concerns.
There are still a lot of questions about the logistics of how a sale to a U.S. company would actually work, because TikTok is basically a clone of its Chinese counterpart. Could ByteDance really separate out TikTok to a Microsoft or a Twitter without and truly address the president's concerns, truly separate itself from China altogether?
Oh, I think you could separate it from China altogether. You'd still have some code writers, I'm sure, in China for the time being, but a company like Microsoft and even Twitter has plenty of people who can write code, plenty of people who can administer enormous social media assets. And from the U.S. point of view, the biggest worries are what kind of political views are going to end up being surfaced for everybody in this medium. And if it's Microsoft, we can be reasonably sure it will reflect the biases of Silicon Valley and not the biases of Beijing. So, yeah, I think that a lot of that can be separated. I don't think the U.S. government could do a great job of separating it, which is why it's very valuable that a large U.S. company is interested in this and is going to negotiate to get sufficient separation that they can actually make a success of the new U.S.-based TikTok.
Now, talk to us about the impact of this when it comes to TikTok versus WeChat, which is arguably a much more vast platform used for so many different things. Of course, the parent company is Tencent, which is a huge global conglomerate. I mean, the implications of this for a WeChat and a Tencent are, perhaps far beyond what they could be for a TikTok. Talk to us about the scope of that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and you're quite right. TikTok is a one-trick pony, and the trick is apparently engrossing, but not the sort of thing that you have to live for. But WeChat in China, people live out of WeChat. They do everything on WeChat, and the idea that the U.S. government would try to put them out of business or make it impossible for them to operate outside of China strikes me as unlikely. I have a feeling that while the government has been thinking a lot about TikTok in a very disciplined way because of CFIUS, which is the investment committee, because the FTC and the Justice Department have been investigating them for mishandling data, they've been thinking about TikTok a long time. I think WeChat got tossed in late in the game, and the government is now very pleased that they saved themselves 45 days to figure out what exactly they're going to do about WeChat. My guess is they've already said we're sanctioning Tencent, but only as to WeChat. So they've already put League of Legends and all of the Tencent properties off to one side. And now I predict they're going to struggle with the question of what are we going to do about WeChat in the United States. I can't not believe that they're going to try to regulate WeChat in China. And then the question is, well, what are you going to do about WeChat when it shows up here on a phone of somebody who's a tourist from Beijing and they want to buy something, and the only way they know how to buy things these days is call up WeChat and buy it. So I think the U.S. government is going to struggle with that, and I would not be surprised to see some delays in the implementation of the restrictions on WeChat.
Right, and you wonder how much of this is political. Now, 2.5 months to an election, and this 45-day window gets us even closer to that. And then if they still don't know what's going on election day, that's a problem.
Well, I do think the administration has, especially the people who are China hawks, have really got the bit between their teeth. They've overridden most of the objections inside the Trump administration to a whole host of restrictions on Chinese influence on U.S. industry, and they're going to start. They're rolling them out week by week. We're going to see more, and I think it's more that the people who are China hawks want to make hay while the sun is shining, rather than that they want this in place by the election. There is a sense in Washington that whatever the Trump administration does in this area, unlike almost every place else where the Trump administration is making policy, that in this area, what they do may stick, because Democrats have not been particularly supportive of being kinder to China or Chinese industry. And so if they make changes in a Biden administration, if the election goes that way, they may not make big changes. They may make them at the margins. And they may not do new things, which is probably why Peter Navarro and others in the White House are dying to get all this done by Election Day.
There certainly is an important deadline coming up. All right, Stewart Baker of Steptoe & Johnson, thank you so much for joining us to weigh in. We're going to continue to try to make sense of and separate out all these issues. All right, coming up, Uber and Lyft have been ordered to make their drivers full-time employees in a huge preliminary ruling out of California. Also, we are awaiting a press conference at the White House. We'll take you there as soon as President Trump takes the podium, now scheduled at the bottom of the hour. This is Bloomberg. Now to a developing story and an early loss that the biggest ride-sharing companies cannot afford to lose. A judge has ordered Uber and Lyft to convert their California drivers from independent contractors to employees with benefits. For more now, we are joined by our Eric Newcomer. Eric, obviously this would be a huge blow to Uber and Lyft if, in fact, this ruling stands. Of course, the companies are going to appeal this, but it is pretty significant that in round one, they've essentially lost. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, when Uber and Lyft went public, this was a major risk factor in their IPO prospectuses. The idea that their workers could become full-time employees. In California, which has been exposed to these companies the longest, has been watching them and fighting with them, finally passed a law called AB5 that pretty much clearly tried to make Uber and Lyft drivers employees. And so now this court judgment is turning that into law after Uber and Lyft resisted and saying, yes, they're employees. And now, of course, there are going to be appeals and more fighting. But it's a strong sign that, California may have its way and make Uber and Lyft drivers full-time employees, which would be a drastic change for the ride-sharing business.
These are also two companies that are struggling in the middle of a pandemic. Ride-sharing has plummeted. Uber Eats has helped make up for some of the loss when it comes to food delivery. But could the companies actually survive this? I mean, they'd have to, obviously pay drivers more, pay them benefits, and then they'd have to charge more for rides as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we really know how it'll look. Uber's said that it would cause prices to increase. They might have to restrict the number of drivers they have. So you could imagine, prices going up and the number of drivers going down. But what happens is anyone's guess. I mean, Uber has an incentive to really make a stink out of this one. You could imagine them pulling from a market, hoping to stop it from spreading to other places, or they'd sort of give it a real try and say, okay, if we restrict to only sort of our most dedicated drivers, how well can we make this work? But Uber has long argued that the whole sort of mechanism of ride sharing depends on drivers being able to sort of join and quit at their ease and respond to sort of market pressure, and that becomes harder once you're having to say, we have to meet certain thresholds to make someone an employee.
All right. Well, we do expect these companies to appeal. And of course, it doesn't just apply to Uber and Lyft, but also DoorDash delivery workers as well. Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer. Eric, thank you so much for joining us to weigh in on that. We're going to continue to follow that one as it develops. All right. Now, coming up, Facebook is launching a new vertical, Facebook Financial. What is it? We'll tell you next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I am Emily Chang. Well, once the center of the pandemic, New York reported 476 new cases today. I should say only 476 new cases, and is preparing to reopen schools in the fall as a result of these low numbers. Joshua Sharfstein, the Vice Dean for Public Health Practice at Johns Hopkins University, spoke earlier with Bloomberg Television about the state's success in containing the virus.
They got right that the virus needed to take priority, that the threat of the virus was practically existential to New York, and that, this was the number one concern. And if they could get this fixed, then other things could happen. And I think that was extremely important, and they conveyed that sense of urgency through all those press conferences and everything else. The second thing is, I think people in New York really understood that, both because of the leadership and because of the sirens and all the things that affected them. And that really mattered for what people did then.
And just one image here, folks. I live right up by the Mount Sinai Hospital complex, and I can tell you the sirens went all night, and at one point I counted 8 ambulances outside Mount Sinai Emergency in the absolute crisis of this. I believe that was back in April. Joshua Sharfstein, what do they need to do in Texas and Florida to do a New York state of mind? Well, I think it's again, prioritizing the virus, getting those levels down so that they can safely do things like open schools and go back to some, essential activities that are threatened by coronavirus. I think, the leadership, the messaging has to be clear, consistent, constant, and there needs to be, if not a
total shutdown like they had in New York, a restriction on some of the activities until they really can drive that number down and not, let up until it's really low enough.
Dr. Sharfstein, how close to herd immunity are we?
It's obviously a question on everyone's mind, and nobody knows for sure. And, I think the fact that the virus affects a lot of people without them knowing it, and the number of people it affects without them knowing it can be estimated at different numbers, makes people wonder whether more people are infected than we really appreciate, which would make it harder for the virus to transmit. An important concept, though, is herd immunity in this context is not, absolute. It's relative, meaning it's not like suddenly we have herd immunity and now the virus is just going to go away. It's more like we slowly get more immunity in the population and it's just a little bit harder to spread. At some point, that'll help push some areas into a time when the virus is going down in the population, but it could still come up if it has the right circumstances. So it's nothing to wait for, like we wake up one day and we have herd immunity. It'd be more like slowly we're seeing that it's just harder for the virus to spread in certain places. And that may partly be the case in New York, that it's, particularly in areas that had such high rates of infection, that it's a little bit harder for the virus to get around there. And that's just an extra level of security. But still, if people were reckless in New York, they could get coronavirus. So I think we shouldn't be waiting for herd immunity. We should be taking steps to protect ourselves, and then maybe we'll start to see the virus come down eventually.
Let's talk about schools. You mentioned it just a moment ago. I saw a report over the weekend. 97,000 children around the United States tested positive in the last 2 weeks of July. That's around a quarter of those tested. Is it the right decision to try and reopen schools in September? There are lots of other factors you need to put into the mix, but nevertheless, we still have significant numbers of children that are carrying the virus. They may be asymptomatic, but they still have it.
I think it's a very questionable decision in areas with high rates of viral spread. I think it's extremely likely, particularly high school students who are mixing with each other in classes and all those things are going to pass the virus around, and potentially other people could get infected. Some kids could get quite sick, their family members. That's what we want to avoid.
Joshua Sharfstein there, Vice Dean of Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which of course is supported by Michael Bloomberg, the founder of the parent company of this network, Bloomberg LP. We are standing by now for the president, expected to take the podium at the White House any minute now. We'll take you there live when it happens. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. TikTok, WeChat, and their parent companies under increasing scrutiny by the United States as the president focuses in on Chinese social media. We've heard a lot about TikTok, but what about WeChat? I want to bring in Isaac Stonefish at the Asia Society Center on the U.S. and China. Isaac, your job over the last several weeks has been incredibly exciting as a result of all of this back and forth, tensions ratcheting up every single day. What do you make of the fact that the president is now training his sights not on just TikTok, but also WeChat and Tencent, which is one of the biggest conglomerates in the world?
WeChat was the first example of a Chinese app that out-innovated US apps. It was really the first global Chinese tech story. And the reaction from the Trump administration here seems to be part actual national security concerns and actual wanting to thwart Beijing's ability to, say, spy on the Chinese diaspora, spy on Americans who are speaking to people in China, and also just to put a thorn in Beijing's side to deflate some of the air in the tires to say, well, okay, you ban Google, Facebook, we're going to ban one of your champions too.
What do you think the actual consequences of this could be?
I think it's in some ways similar to sanctions, where the direct consequences might not be that apparent, but the ability for Tencent and WeChat to potentially raise more capital from US investors, the ability of Chinese traveling overseas to use WeChat, the ability, they've said so far, it's not going to affect other Tencent businesses, but I find that hard to believe because if you tarnish WeChat and if you make WeChat sort of an app non grata in the US landscape, it's got to have effects on Tencent's gaming businesses and on its other businesses as well.
And of course, WeChat is the primary reason that people buy phones in China. So if Apple or Google have to take it out of their app stores, that could also have a devastating effect on US companies. I mean, do you imagine that it'll really come to that?
That's an excellent point. The ability for Apple to operate in China, and like all foreign companies, it operates by the grace of the Communist Party and not because of issues of competition or regulatory fairness. It's certainly possible this could have a huge impact on especially Apple, but also other US platforms that operate in China, not only because of what's happened to TikTok, but what's happened to WeChat, but this is also a really good opportunity for Beijing to either loudly or quietly retaliate against other US tech companies. And a lot of times when Beijing does retaliate, it's not going to be a very clear, okay, you did this, therefore we're doing that. It could be something as simple as a larger than expected tax bill to Apple, or Cisco Systems finding that one of its offices gets raided for unexplained reasons. There's other quieter ways that Beijing can put pressure on US tech companies, ostensibly as revenge for what's happening to Tencent and WeChat.
Now, what do you make of the TikTok side of the story? This is a company that 100 million Americans use. Now you have potentially Twitter expressing interest here. You know, Twitter or Microsoft is one of those a better bet?
TikTok is the second example of Chinese tech innovation that's really swarmed the world in a very, very impressive way. This right now is Microsoft's acquisition to lose. They have a much larger war chest. It seems like, as far as we can tell, that Trump did this with a Microsoft acquisition in mind. There doesn't really seem to be any other major companies that are angling. You know, there certainly could be some very last-minute surprise from a company like Amazon, but it seems like the safest guess right now, if it does actually get purchased by an American company, that Microsoft would be the one to take it.
Meantime, there's this issue about how well TikTok is complying with an order in terms of how it treats the data of children on the platform. That is now getting dredged up today by the FTC and the DOJ. What do you make of that in the context of all of this?
I think it's another reason that the Trump administration and various arms of the US government are putting forward to explain why TikTok is problematic and why TikTok is a risk. The company does say on its website that other affiliates and subsidiaries and the parent company can have access to TikTok's data. So even though the company says it's walled off from its Chinese partners, certainly it's very easy to imagine Beijing or the Chinese parent using either legal Chinese means or extra legal Chinese means, accessing all of this data, regardless of whatever safeguards they put up. So this is just another way for the US government to say, hey, we actually have a case here against TikTok. This is not frivolous.
Until now, Huawei has been the major Chinese tech company that's been in the spotlight. Today, another development, the Pentagon saying it will share spectrum with U.S. wireless carriers. There are a lot of concerns about the race to 5G and whether China could beat the United States in that race. What do you make of this latest development?
This is a very positive development for 5G in the United States and also for autonomous vehicles whose potential success really rests on rapid and comprehensive 5G development. There's been complaints from industry partners that the Pentagon is acting as a hog, taking up way too much of the bandwidth of the spectrum. And so this does feel like a promising step that the US government is really trying to encourage the rollout of 5G, because right now, even though we're ahead of China on AVs, we're definitely behind in the 5G race. So this does seem quite promising.
How concerned do you believe the United States should be about the rise of the Chinese tech sector? Obviously, 5G is one thing, but there's also concerns that China could own sort of the rise of the new form of social media. Is that really a big concern?
Yes, I think it is. And I think in the policy community, they're trying to start to distinguish between what is, and I hate to use the word fair in foreign policy and international relations, where might makes right, but trying to distinguish between what is a heavily state-backed company like Huawei or a state-owned enterprise like China Mobile that is an arm of the state and should be treated as such, and what is a Chinese company that has done a lot of really excellent, innovative things, and if it can act in a way that doesn't jeopardize American national security, should be allowed to flourish in the United States. But the problem is that Beijing does believe that the companies that grow up in China are part of the party, at least, in a vague sense, and often ways that should have to act in the interests of the party. So it's really difficult to try to pick out and tease out what is a fair way to treat Chinese companies. There's so many really brilliant Chinese entrepreneurs and engineers who have made really amazing products. And it doesn't really seem fair to say, well, just because you're Chinese, you can't be allowed to innovate in this way. On the other hand, we are in a situation where both TikTok and WeChat do have national security implications for the United States. So it's something that's really begging for a louder public debate in the United States as we try to unpack and untangle these really thorny issues.
And they are quite tangled. Isaac Stonefish of the Asia Society, always good to have your commentary here on the show. Thank you so much for stopping by. Coming up, we are awaiting a news briefing by the president. We'll take you to the White House as soon as that begins. We'll have more of Bloomberg Technology after this quick break. Facebook is unveiling a new group to pursue payments and commerce plans under the leadership of David Marcus, the co-creator of its Libra cryptocurrency project, also the CEO of PayPal before he went over to work at Facebook. The latest step in a company-wide effort to bring Facebook's individual products and apps closer together. Joining me now to discuss, Bloomberg's Kurt Wagner. Facebook Financial, Kurt, what exactly does this mean?
Yeah, this is mostly a reorg at this point. It's a new team, as you mentioned, led by David Marcus. And the idea is to bring all of Facebook's different payments projects under one universal leadership and one universal game plan. So right now, there were a number of different things they were trying to do. They're trying to create this kind of universal credit card, debit card system called Facebook Pay. They're trying to roll out payments in WhatsApp in countries like India and Brazil. And, of course, they were building a digital wallet for the Libra currency. And all of those were kind of operating simultaneously, but not within the same group. Now those all operate under David Marcus, with the idea being that one unified team might make things a little smoother for Facebook.
What do you make of the fact that Facebook is doing this right now?
Well, I think we've seen them attempt to bring their different apps closer together a number of different ways in the last couple of years. You might recall that they kind of rebranded everything so that it was now Instagram by Facebook, WhatsApp by Facebook, or from Facebook, trying to make sure that people know that this is all one company. We're obviously seeing this on their messaging front. They're going to allow people to send messages between all these apps. So I think this is just another step in that direction of really unifying the whole company and trying to make everything kind of under one umbrella, right? It's probably better for regulation, too, if you just have one team of people working on all of the payments products so that regulators aren't talking to people on 3 or 4 different teams. So I think this is really a regulation issue, but also it shows how important payments is because David Marcus is a big deal inside Facebook. So the fact that he's being put in charge of this, I think, is a signal that this is a really important thing to Mark Zuckerberg.
So what is the latest on Libra? Obviously, we know there was a ton of pushback from lawmakers, folks around the world, even some of the partners that they had signed on. And now you have Facebook feeling this antitrust scrutiny. Where does that leave Libra right now?
Well, I asked David this question because I was wondering if his new role meant that Libra was kind of taking a back seat. He informed me that no, he is still working on Novi, which is the Libra wallet that Facebook is building. But I think the real distinction here is that Libra is no longer just a Facebook product, right? It was clearly born within Facebook. Facebook was instrumental in getting it up and kind of running, but now it is run by an outside association. It has its own CEO. And so David was basically like, listen, I have a little bit more time now that I'm not necessarily shepherding this thing through the initial phases of being created. So he says that Libra is still supposedly going to come by the end of this year. They're preparing the wallet Facebook is building as if Libra will come by the end of the year. So this is not meant to be a signal that Libra is in any way being sidelined. It's just that Facebook and David aren't quite as involved as they once were, which frees them up to do some of these other things.
Kurt, we're standing by now for the president to give another news briefing at the White House. We'll take you there as soon as that begins. But of course, following the latest developments on this TikTok situation, over the weekend reports that Twitter was also potentially interested in buying TikTok's U.S. operations. Of course, we've done a lot of reporting on Microsoft and the talks happening there. What do you make of this new Twitter development and whether that's a real option?
You know, when I first saw that, it caught me by surprise because I don't think of Twitter as being a company that's really at a position to do something like this for a number of reasons, the most obvious being I don't think it has the money to acquire someone like TikTok. I think there's also the fact that the CEO, Jack Dorsey, is not necessarily President Donald Trump's favorite tech executive at the moment. So is this really something that he's going to sign off on? I don't know. But, you know, when you look at where TikTok could land, you look at the idea of merging Twitter with TikTok, right? I think that's probably the only way something like this would work. It is kind of an interesting idea because Twitter is not an antitrust threat like a lot of these other big tech companies. So maybe providing TikTok under a Twitter banner, so to speak, could make a little bit more sense from regulation that way. We have seen Twitter kind of screw up Vine in the past, which is very similar. So, you know, it'd be interesting to give them almost a second chance at getting that right. But I think that Microsoft is still very much probably the best option at the moment. But it makes sense that Twitter would, at the very least, you know, make a phone call, figure out what the options are. I think every tech company would probably do that, knowing how valuable TikTok is.
What is your reporting on the latest in the negotiations between Microsoft and TikTok? You know, what's actually happening in the room, given all of the complications and the sense that even inside the room at the Oval Office at the White House, there's not necessarily clarity about how this should happen?
Well, if you think about all the different little nuances and details that need to be figured out for a deal like this to work, it's quite staggering, right? And we've talked about some of this before over the last week or so. But even the idea of who would run a new U.S. version of TikTok, right? That is the kind of thing that has to be ironed out before you make a deal like this, I think. And so it's a detail like that. It's a detail about data transfer, data storage, user privacy. How do you make sure that TikTok continues to work with the versions of TikTok in other parts of the world? So I think there's a lot of logistics that are going into this beyond just simply price. And the kind of ticking clock here, you know, this 5-week deadline that the president has set, obviously makes a lot of this a lot more urgent maybe than it would otherwise be. But I think those are the questions that these companies are likely trying to hash out, because you don't want to get to a deal and then look back and say, wow, we still have, you know, a dozen very important questions that we didn't touch on simply because we were trying to make this new timeline.
Now, let's talk about the evolution in social media behavior. There were some folks over the weekend commenting about how TikTok user behavior is basically the next stories, like Snap Stories, Instagram Stories, this, you know, idea of just short, very, very short form videos, perhaps set to music, and that TikTok really has a lock on that. We know Facebook and Instagram have now we're actually going to go to the president now. Let's take a listen in. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us.
Some mail-in voting that just was revealed, just the news. 500,000 incorrect absentee ballot applications were sent all across the state of Virginia, including to many dead people. This was an unprecedented mailing flub that's heightened concerns about the integrity of expanding mail-in voting and mail-in voting efforts. It's a disaster. All over Virginia, 500,000 votes. So that's something you have to think about. We don't want to have a rigged election. I know that. And you have to be very careful when you mention, as you constantly do, Russia, or you mention China, or you mention Iran, or others that attack our election system. And when you have this mail-in voting, it's very susceptible. It's something that can be easily attacked by foreign countries and by, frankly, Democrats and by Republicans. And I think that it's something you have to start thinking about very seriously. Our system's not equipped for it. The post office is not equipped for it. And people should vote like they did in World War I and World War II. And your numbers will be, in 90 days or less, your numbers will be very good, I think, much better on the coronavirus or the China virus. But it's something you have to look at and say, this is just crazy. This just came out, 500,000 incorrect ballot applications sent all over the state of Virginia to many people that weren't living. They had some sent to pets, dogs. This is what we're going to get into, and it's going to be a disaster. And it's going to be thought of very poorly. It's going to hurt our country. After our news conference Saturday night and the pro-growth announcement, we're pro-jobs, pro-health safety, executive orders, the stock market went up 358 points today. So we issued those executive orders, and the stock market went up 358 points today. It's quite a reaction. The Dow Jones and the S&P 500 are now up 50% since March. 50%. Think if you had money in there, if you put your money in March, you're 50%. The NASDAQ index continues to set new records. It's been up over 14 times, new record in NASDAQ. And the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones are going to be, I mean, the way they're going, it looks like they're just about going to be topping records, hopefully soon. Excuse me?
Wait, stand by.
So just a quick appearance there from President Trump talking about mail-in voting. Obviously, this has been a subject of intense scrutiny, and the president has made some, additional statements on it. Interesting to see that he just came in and left. We're going to continue to follow what the president just said and bring you any developments as we get them. I also now want to bring in our Lucas Shaw, who is joining us now on a story that he put out over the weekend and an interview with the CEO of Warner Media, Jason Kilar. Lucas, thank you so much for joining us. A big get for you, this conversation with Jason Kilar, who is new in this job and obviously has some important things to work out under him. Importantly, HBO and HBO Max. Talk to us about the highlights from this interview.
Jason took over the job about 3 months ago. And this was, I had been asking to speak with him pretty much as soon as he did it. He is one of the most pressing executives in the media business. He was the founding CEO of Hulu, really guided that streaming service to compete directly with Netflix for many years. He chose to speak after kind of his first major act, leaving Warner Media on Friday, a really surprise move that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. He dismissed 3 of his senior-most deputies, including the 2 people who were primarily responsible for HBO Max, which is their new streaming service, which is designed to compete with the likes of Netflix and Disney+. And Jason really framed this as a reorganization of what has been a pretty old and kind of siloed media company to try to better compete in the streaming age. I'm sure there are a lot of employees at that company who take some umbrage for that. HBO has obviously been very successful over the years, but it was a company that was not perhaps in the right position to compete with or compete in this new landscape.
And I just want to clarify what just happened with that White House press conference. Apparently, security asked the president to step aside. We're actually looking at the feed now and can see security speaking to the president. So that's perhaps why he left so abruptly there. But if that does get underway again, we will bring you back to that. Meantime, Lucas, talk to us a little bit about the job that Jason Kilar has ahead of him, given that content is stalled, production has stopped around the world as a result of this pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of backed up projects. Where does that leave his priorities?
I think it means that over the next 9 months to a year, that HBO Max is going to rely very heavily on HBO. HBO does have a good number of big projects coming out, including a show in the next week or two called Lovecraft Country that comes from J.J. Abrams and Jordan Peele, who is the leader and filmmaker of Get Out. That's something that they have really high hopes for. But Kilar is pretty honest that HBO Max hasn't had a breakout original hit yet, and that they are going to have some problems probably early to mid next year because they're just getting up and running in some international territories, and there is still almost no scripted programming being developed in the United States. It means most streaming services are going to run into some kind of roadblock the middle of next year, and I'll be very curious to see how it affects the likes of Netflix and Disney+. Netflix in particular has been pretty adamant that it's going to be okay. But I think it's hard to imagine that they will be completely unscathed by the pandemic.
And sort of over-under, Lucas, we have only about 30 seconds left. But do you think that Kilar can sort of retain the crown that HBO has had for so many years under new management, having put out so many hit shows? Can he continue that in the midst of all of this competition?
I think he should be able to, because Casey Bloys, who was already in charge of HBO programming, remains in charge of HBO programming. The only question is, does he get stretched a little bit too thin? Does his team get stretched a little bit too thin trying to program HBO, HBO Max, and the Turner cable networks?
All right, Bloomberg's Lucas Shaw, thank you so much for that update. You can check out more of Lucas's interview with Warner Media CEO Jason Kilar at Bloomberg.com. And we are still standing by for the president to retake the podium. He started his news briefing, but quickly left the room, apparently due to some security issues. We've been watching him speak with his security officials on camera. You can see folks still in the room there, or perhaps apparently leaving. So if that does get underway again, we will take you there. Unclear what the status of that is at this point. And thanks so much for watching this edition of Bloomberg Technology. More Bloomberg Television after this quick break. Bloomberg Daybreak Australia is next. This is Bloomberg.